Thank you for joining the Blueberry Educational Conference. I'm Zach Williams. I'm the Bacon County Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent with the University of Georgia and will be the moderator for this session. I'd like to thank Meister Media for sponsoring the 2024 Blueberry Educational Conference. So I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Abraham Babiker. He's with USDA ARS, Thad Cochran Southern Horticultural Laboratory, and he'll be giving us a presentation on new blueberry cultivars for gardeners and commercial growers in the Southeast.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming to the session. So today I'm going to talk about the new blueberry cultivar that we developed at the Southern Horticultural Research Lab in Poplarville, Mississippi. But before I start, I will just talk briefly about blueberry history. So we have three types of blueberry: low bush blueberry, which is mainly grown in Northeast. And then we have the high bush blueberry, which include northern high bush and southern high bush. And we have the rabbit eye blueberry. So my focus today is going to be mainly about rabbit eye blueberry. But also we work on southern high bush, which is interspecific hybrid between northern high bush and native species in the Southeast. So what we are trying to do, we are trying to introduce genes for adaptation to rabbit eye from wild rabbit eye. And recently we started working with Vaccinium constablei, which is a hexaploid species. I don't know if you could see the Vaccinium constablei species, which has frost tolerant, and the reason for that, we are trying to introduce adaptation to frost and fruit quality trait from constablei into rabbit eye species, or Vaccinium virgatum. Also, we are using native species such as Vaccinium darwii to introduce low chill requirement to northern high bush and develop southern high bush cultivar adapted to the region, and Vaccinium tenellum, which has short fruit development period, so between flowering and ripening. So this way you could get late flowering cultivar, but at the same time it ripe early. And we are using also Iliotai. It has disease resistant, and Vaccinium arboreum, which is in a different section, but it has wide adaptation to soil in the Southeast. And as you see here, like it's a long process. So when we cross usually this species with the high bush cultivar, you have to do back crosses because the first generation, they will be like more wild. So you have to do several cycle of back crossing to get the fruit quality trait and the berry size. So the breeding cycle usually starts by crossing the two parents, and then if we need to do back cross, we have to germinate the seedling and do first round of selection, which is mainly subjective. So the selection just based on plant architecture, the berry size, berry firmness, and then out of 10,000 seedling that we grow, so we could select 200 seedling and then replicate them, like grow 6 plant bear or 6 plant bear genotype at one location. So then if we like any of the selection, then we will go for multi-site evaluation. And the trait that we consider when we do selection, we have trait that the growers need, and then we have the fruit quality trait that the consumer needs. So we have to look for firmness, which is one of the traits that most of the consumer looking for, the berry size, and then we have the fruit quality trait, so the total acid, total sugar, pH, and the sugar to acid ratio, which is also very important for the consumer. So we also we develop like high throughput phenotyping tool, so that's allow us to screen a large number of selection and speed the breeding process. So growth trait that we are looking for is the yield, which is one of the traits that we look for like at the last stage of the breeding program. We also look for the tolerance to biotic and abiotic stresses, such as frost tolerant, adaptation to mineral soil. And we have also like trait that we are looking for machine harvestability. So you need loose cluster, you need dry stem scar, you need uniform ripening. And this is for fresh producer. Like if you are like big, most likely you need something that has extended period of blooming. So we have different breeding objective based on what growers like, you know, what kind of growers that need to grow these cultivars. So other important trait, as I said, the berry diameter and the berry firmness, and we have frost tolerant, we have concentrated ripening, and then one of the traits that we are looking for is a short fruit development period, and this is to avoid the frost tolerance. So we have certain selection that they bloom late, but we are trying to get genes from Ellioti and Tenalum that they have really short fruit development period, around 40 days for Southern highbush. So if we could get late bloom and short fruit development period, then the growers could get or harvest, you know, during the first 2 weeks of May. So this way he could get early to the market. At the same time, he could avoid the frost tolerant. I mean the frost damage. In addition, we have like, as I mentioned, the continuous blooming. This is one of the traits that we need for cultivar that goes to big or for homeowner that they like to grow blueberry cultivar in their homes, because you get like extended period of blooming and extended period of harvest. So then, based on the first selection, then we take like those selection that they pass the test, and then we propagate them and we put them at multi-location. So basically here, like what I'm showing, those are the top 20 cultivars or selection that we tested in 2 years, like 2021, 2022. And as you see, like we have our control is Abundance and Miss Alice. So we have like here 2 selection that MS 1125, it's among the top 20 in 2 years. So this way we propagate MS 1125 and test it at different locations. So one of the new releases that we have is Muffin Man. It's an ornamental edible blueberry rabbit eye cultivar. It has this notable fall coloring in leaves and numerous unique pale pink blooms. So also it has colorful berry, as I'm going to show in the second slide, and it has heat and drought tolerance. So it's an ideal choice for the home gardeners in USDA hardiness zone from 8 to 9. And this is where we tested. But probably if it has bright well in the background, so if you have bright well in your region, most likely it will be more adapted to your region. So as most of the southern, I mean the blueberry cultivar, it has self-incompatibility. So we have one of the USDA release cultivar, pink lemonade, so we recommend to be planted with pink lemonade. So as I mentioned, it's a public domain, so if you need cutting, if you have a nursery, you could get it from the National Plant Germplasm in Oregon. So the second cultivar that we release also, it's a USDA Spears. It's a rabbit eye cultivar. It's also a public domain, so you could get it from the USDA in Corvallis, or you could reach to me and we could send you plant to test. So it has very good adaptation, and here in this photo, this is like 12 years old plant. So as you see, it has like it's more like semi-dwarf. It requires minimum like pruning, so you don't have to prune it like other rabbit eye cultivars. And here the quality, like when we grow it, we test it like for 5 years, and this is the average here. So it's comparable to Brightwell and Climax, but at the same time, it's more like semi-dwarf, a characteristic that, you know, will reduce the cost of growing these plants. One of the other characteristics, it bloom late and avoid the frost damage, but also it ripe early, so it has like short fruit development period compared to other release rabbit eye cultivars. Also, it has very good quality, and the berry size is bigger compared to other rabbit eye cultivars. One of the new selection that we have, and it has potential to be a cultivar, it's MS 1425. So as you see here, the berry's diameter is between 25 and 27 millimeter, and it has the average berry weight is 5 to 7 grams. It's moderately productive, but it has a niche. You know, it could go like for homeowners, or it could go for big farms. So if you are interested in this, also you could sign a material agreement, material transfer agreement, and test it in your field. So with this, you know, this is like the USDA. So if you are interested in any of the selection, please reach to us. So if you just write USDA RS Poplarville, Mississippi, you could find my name, or reach to Steve Stringer, the breeder. And as I said, if you are willing to sign material transfer agreement, we could send you around like about 12 plants per selection to test it in your field. So with this, I would take your questions.
When you talk about frost retention, are you saying temperature is still the same that will do damage? What you're doing is trying to get us a later blooming berry, is that correct?
Yeah, they bloom late, but at the same time, actually, there is a variation. You know, certain selection, they could tolerate, like for example, the Vaccinium constablei, that could take low temperature. Still, the bloom, they don't get like damage compared to other selections. But what we are trying to get something that bloom late, because if they bloom, for example, first week, second week of March, and then they have short fruit development is 45 days. So this way you could get still to the market by mid-May. So you could avoid the frost damage. But if the selection, especially most of the Southern highbush that they have low chill, they bloom early, like first week of January. Right now I have some that they have berry on them. So those one, they get damaged. So we have tested most of the relays, Southern highbush cultivars, and for 4 years, you know, probably 1 year that we don't have frost damage, and we were able to harvest all of them. But most of them, within the 4 years, we lost like the crop. So in addition to that, also the adaptation to the soil. So most of the Southern highbush, they don't have like really good adaptation. That's why we are focusing on rabbit eye, because it has the soil adaptation. But we have the rabbit eye that they bloom early, but what we need is just we need to get frost tolerant, and we need to get the short fruit development into the rabbit eye. You're welcome. It's a Southern highbush, yeah.
So up next we have Dr. Wesley Porter with the University of Georgia Extension. He's going to give us a presentation on the research and applications for the blueberry irrigation scheduling as well as the app.
Thanks, Zach. Good morning. Welcome, everybody, in here. So I'm going to talk specifically about blueberries and some of the app development work we've been doing. I think later today there's another talk about blueberry fertigation and irrigation. I think it's really good. And then tomorrow in the Precision Ag session, we have a grad student that's presenting that's been working with sweet corn app development. I think she's going to go a little bit deeper into some of the general work that we've done on these app developments. So if you like some of what you hear today, I'm not going as deep into the meat, kind of maybe come to one of those other sessions, you can get a little bit deeper into it. So the next couple of slides, these are like my core slides I use in my irrigation talks. And most of the time it's to row crop producers, but I think these are applicable to everyone. I like to share them so that you see where we're at and where we stand with stuff. And so really what I see from this, and this is the USDA NASS irrigation survey. Nothing special going on here. It's done every 5 years. I checked the other day, the results for the 2023 survey are going to be released late in 24. So I think in November of 24 I can update these slides. And all I do is compile the data. Here's some of your southeastern states. And, those of you who've never seen this data shared by me before, you might look at it and say, all right, well, these total above 100%. Well, that's true. But how the guys are answering is, well, I'll see, if I'm starting to see visible stress in my field, then I might go out there and actually check the soil. Or if I'm looking at this or looking at that. And so hopefully after my talk today, and I'm going to share some data with you on some of the blueberry irrigation research we've done, you'll see that utilizing either an app or a sensor is a much better method than either a visible stress or doing a weekly calendar schedule. And so each one of these are applicable to different types of crops when you look through. I hope that nobody's doing visible stress on most of our high value crops here. If I'm in a room full of row crop producers, a lot more of them are going to be doing that, and they're saying, wait till we see visible stress. We notice that soil moisture sensor adoption overall is low. We're hoping that we see that value get higher over time. Calendar schedule, I would say, is pretty popular when we're looking at drip irrigation systems where we're running systems on particular days and times. And then if you don't know what you're doing, if you're lost, just try to follow what your neighbor does, right? If you do that, then you're going to figure it out. All right, I see some laughs. Good. We got the joke even this early morning on Friday. All right, I like this slide, and we'll pick on them. It's a Southeast Regional Conference, but I like this slide because I work for University of Georgia Extension. If I work, and Laura over there said, yes, that's right. If I work for one of the other states in there, perhaps, maybe there's nobody from Mississippi here, I might not share this slide, or, if I work somewhere else. But what I see from this slide is, hey, where do you guys get your irrigation-specific irrigation information from? And what this slide tells me is that, hey, 80% of guys come to us as their first source of information. I think that's really good. It shows, and hopefully it'll go up even higher in our 23 survey. But it shows me that we're doing a good job getting you guys information and getting it out there to you. So you can look at that, and if you're in a different state, look and see kind of where you stand and think about, hey, where do I get my irrigation information from? Where's my front line phone call that I make? So hopefully it's your extension agent. If not, hopefully you've got a good valid source of information out there. And then this one is the last one that I'll share from this survey. This one for me is a hard one to swallow, and we did this time of year for us extension guys, we're busy doing a bunch of meetings, and like Zach got to see me yesterday, got to see me today, he got to hear a cotton irrigation talk by me yesterday. And so when we're talking about it from cotton today, but the day even before that I did another cotton irrigation talk, and some of our agents hadn't shown up yet, and I said, the hard thing knowing from the irrigation perspective, this slide and the way this one's answered for me is number one reason that we're not improving water conservation if people are answering that it's not a priority on the farm. So I made the joke in that agent training on Tuesday or Wednesday, whatever day it was, I've lost this week, that the agents that weren't there yet, irrigation wasn't a priority for them in their county. They didn't care what I was going to say whether or not. That means that whether they'd have showed up, they were going to sit in the back and play on their phones or not care there. So hopefully a third of y'all are not ignoring me. The third just behind the speaker that I can't see right now, you're on your phones. Right, so hopefully everybody in the room's here to listen to the talk and hear. But when you know that you go into a room that approximately a third of the people, they say that when you're talking about technology that it's not a priority, well, that's kind of difficult, right? Well, I think irrigation management and water management is one of our most critical priorities on any crop that we grow, Right? It's one of our most limited natural resources, and it's one that we can have the most effect on with most of our crops that we grow. So moving down from that, people say that you cannot afford improvements to it, and I would also disagree with that. What these tell me is that we just have to do a better job showing that the economics and return on investment of advanced scheduling methods. And then number 3, improvements won't reduce costs enough to cover new costs. And then below that, you know, how we could get lost in some of those, but the percentages, one, are pretty low, and then some of them I would say, even though these are Georgia-specific numbers, some of them I don't think are quite valid, or maybe they misunderstood in the way they were answering them. All right, either way, let's talk numbers for a minute before we get into using technology and some implications of using technology. Where does that stand? Why is it costly to irrigate? So these are our UGA enterprise budgets, and we've got one of our UGA economists in the room. I'm not going to point him out. He's a new hire, but y'all go after him if you don't like these numbers, okay? Y'all can figure out who he is in a minute. But I asked him every year, you know, where are our numbers at and what do they look like? And I shared these. And I will say in about every room I'm in, generally it's not happening in this room, and that's fine. But I see phones go up more on this slide and take pictures because it's just a good value to have and like something to have in your back pocket. Now, is this directly applicable to all drip systems? Maybe not. It's usually calculated on our larger scale irrigation systems, but I think it's going to get you in the ballpark. I've heard values range in the $3 up to the $7 and $8 per acre inch range for electrical applied irrigation per acre inch. Okay, so you keep that in mind where it really gets costly, and I don't know how a lot of you guys are irrigating. I know in some of my familiarity with some of the fruit and vegetable world, a lot of times we're irrigating from surface water sources, and sometimes we're pulling pumps and motors around using diesel or gas, and so that's where it does get more costly for you guys. So that number is a little more applicable. I think that's more common in fruit and vegetables than it is in row crops, right, where we're going to have a set well. So I'm not saying that y'all don't have wells and not pumping with them. It's just a little bit different sometimes. And so that's about $20 per acre inch right now for diesel. And we all know that because diesel prices are staying pretty consistent in the $3.50 per range or up a little higher depending on where you're at. And that's a hard pill to swallow if I'm being honest. You know, you really got to make that decision. Do I really need this irrigation event today or not? And, you know, where is it at? Is it really going to benefit me or not? So you play with these numbers how you want. I leave that 500 acres up there just as a general rule of thumb. That's more my row crop guys, but I say, you know, average farm size 1,000 acres, 50% of most of our row crops are irrigated, and on average we apply about 10 inches of irrigation to them. You know, how does that translate to blueberries? We can look back in the curves I'm about to share with you in just a minute, and you can determine. But again, you know, in that example, that's $70,000 we're investing in irrigation just to move the water. That is a significant input. So if somebody tells me that it's not a significant input, I would argue with you on that, right? It is significant, and we move that water. We're pumping it from source to site. We're using a lot of money to do that, so just keep it in mind. All right, so let's move into blueberry specific for a little while, talk about what we've been doing. Typically during the growing season, we're going to look at needing about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of water per week during the growing season. The one thing to remember, and as I talk through this, I guess you can ask questions at the end, or if I say something that's confusing, stop me now. I don't care, and ask questions now about it. But when we start talking about utilizing the app, I want you to remember when we're making irrigation recommendations, that's total water. That's rainfall plus irrigation, right? We need to do a good job tracking our rainfall. And I think hopefully on specialty crops we do a really good job. I think sometimes on row crops we don't do as good a job as what I would like for our guys to do. But if we don't know what we're applying to them in general, we're just turning the systems on and running for a set amount of run time and not keeping a track of that. It's hard to know at the end of the season really what our return is. On blueberries, you all know this, the demand for water is highest from the time of fruit expansion until harvest. During the final stages of fruit filling, this is when it gets really critical that you stay on top of it and knowing what you're running. Uniform soil moisture is required. Surges in moisture level we know can cause fruit splitting, and we know there's nothing that we can do about excessive rainfall or rogue rainfall events during that time. So we want to do the best we can with irrigation to manage that. And then general research has shown proper moisture monitoring reduce water use up to 40% without affecting yield and fruit quality. So keep that in mind, that if we can have a potential 40% reduction in the amount of water we're applying, use the numbers I gave you earlier and extrapolate that to your farm and say, all right, is this 40%, if I use these advanced methods he's about to tell me about, is it applicable to my farm or not? You know, can it really pay for me paying for a sensor or investing in some time and true, you know, more in-depth irrigation scheduling? So generally I'll say irrigation is scheduled, and this is, I think you could take blueberries out of there and put it on most of our drip crops and say we're using timer schedules, right? We know our drip tape design, we know our flow rate per time, and we know what our application rate is, so we're going to set our timers, or if we don't have a timer, we're going to do it manually. We're going to run it for X amount of time and put this amount out. Would anybody disagree with me on that? Okay, it seems like we're good there. So ranges depending, 30 minutes to 3 hours per zone. If we're not careful, field observations, especially in blueberries, because we're doing, especially in Georgia. Now, maybe some other states are a little different. I'm more familiar with blueberry production in Georgia, where we're putting them on pine bark beds, very coarse material, a lot of sand. We build that up. That irrigation, in that case, is going to infiltrate below the rooting depth. If we have an irrigation duration longer than 20 minutes, so some of you are shaking your head. Yes, so we got to be really careful, don't we? So pulsed irrigation, and I think that's the talk this afternoon. He's going to talk about pulsed irrigation and fertigation and how we really manage that. So hopefully it couples good with what I tell you today and what we're looking at in the data I'm going to share with you. But pulsed irrigation is ideal when we're doing that, and if we've got an automatic irrigation system, we can turn it on, run it for 15 or 20 minutes on this zone, rotate to this zone, then come back around to meet that need. Everybody follows what I mean with that, right? It's pretty simplified. We're doing it 15, 20 minutes at a time. If we do that multiple times throughout the day, we're reducing water use, usually reducing loss of fertilizer, and hopefully increasing our yields because we're keeping that that bed where it needs to be. I'll say, just like row crops, there hasn't been as extensive water use curve development for blueberries, though. So that's what this research started, is we wanted to develop a water use curve for blueberries in the southern region. So let's talk about what we've been doing. We had a postdoc research scientist work with us on this for a few years, and he was doing a couple of different things. He's since left and taken a full faculty job, so he's not leading this anymore. We haven't done a ton of this work in the past year or two, but with our new blueberry specialist at University of Georgia, she thought we should start promoting some of this. I have not seen her. She's probably in another room right now. Thought we should start promoting this again and pick this work back up. So Zilfina has interest in us kind of ramping this type of work back up. So keep that in mind that we're wanting to do that. But doing a lot of research by Yakos et al. And again, I was working with him. I got him started on this project. But we were targeting developing a more robust, smart irrigation scheduling tool for blueberries. And so years ago, even prior to my time, right before I started at University of Georgia, there was some federal funding that came in to develop a suite of smart irrigation scheduling apps, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. But so that's where the foundation of this started, and so we've tried to apply these to the crops that we feel like we can do and necessary. So two main areas of focus in irrigation, the time of that work we were doing, were the smart irrigation scheduling app and scheduling utilizing UASs. And I'm not talking about the UASs here. If you're interested in that, reach out to me after, but that was some thermal work that we did looking at variability over fields and a few other things. This one specifically looking at the app, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. So you can find the apps, and I can talk a little bit deeper with you, but most of these apps are going to work across the southern region. So keep that in mind. They're going to work across your southern region. All you guys from southern region are there. And if you're in a state that it's not easy, you don't have weather stations, or you've got a lot of weather stations and you feel like it's not integrated, please reach out to us and we'll see what we can do about that. The nice thing too about some of the apps is there's also commercially available weather stations that you can buy, like Meter, Davis, and some of those that can be integrated directly in too. So so keep that in mind. But it's an interactive ET-based irrigation scheduling tool. They operate on either a smartphone or a tablet platform, or Android and iOS both. I've used a lot of the different apps. Now, they all work a little bit fundamentally different, and I think Emily's going to talk a little bit about that in her presentation tomorrow. I'm not going to get that deep into it. And right now, they're currently free. We've been fortunate enough that through our commodity commissions and some other federal funding sources that we've able to keep the programming cost free for the end user. So you can go download these right now for free. It's not going to cost you anything. You can use it for free, etc. And we hope to keep it like that forever. We would hope to not have to add a fee, but we may have to, way into the future, just so we can keep the programming up. But if you go to that website, this isn't all of them, but we've got a lot of different apps on that website, and a lot of them are becoming available every day. We've got about 10 or 15 of them. But again, some of them work fundamentally different. So if you're downloading one for like a row crop you've been using it, and then you switch over to blueberries and you're confused about stuff, for sure reach out to us, because I'm going to talk about how the blueberry one works, and it's a little bit different than what we do for our row crops, and we're going to talk about that. But what we need to remember how they work is we're estimating crop evapotranspiration. So it's just what is the crop and the soil losing. That's what evapotranspiration is out of those bushes. And then we're trying to account for rain and irrigation infiltrating back in. So nothing that specific, that special, but what we did is we took a few years and we installed soil moisture sensors in the field, and we tried to redevelop the crop coefficient curve for blueberries. Here's your crop coefficient curve. Probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you guys. All this means is that we're pulling an evaporation data, or evapotranspiration data from a weather station, and then multiplying this crop coefficient by it. So as long as we can get ET data from a weather station, you multiply this crop coefficient by it, we know what our estimated daily water requirement is for blueberries in a particular time of year. And you see we've set it up on Julian date in this particular scenario. So this is embedded in the background of the app. That's the science that's sitting there. All right, just to give you some screen captures of it so you can see, and you can even, it's kind of blurry on the phone screen, but on the computer screen, these look fairly good up here, so hopefully y'all can kind of see them. And I want to talk you through what you're seeing here. You want to look at it and see, the first thing is the width of rows. So what's the width of the bushes in there? You need to put that in. When do you typically want to irrigate this field? And then what water conservation mode do you want to set up, and what you're looking at. And we've got a couple different options there. It's more of an efficiency setup. And then when we go in and set it up, it's going to ask you some parameters about your drip system. So you need to know that. You need to know what your flow rates and some of that is, because what it's going to do is use that information and tell you, based on the date, how much you need to irrigate. So if you notice here, irrigation rate of this system is at a rate of 0.34 gallons per minute. So down here, is saying that we need to irrigate for 55 minutes over this particular bed, or the irrigation amount is going to equate to right under 2,200 gallons. And when we look over here, it provides you with notifications that tells you how much you should irrigate on each farm. In this particular case, this is a 0.04 of an inch rain event, right? That's negligible. Wouldn't even worry about that one. Here you got 0.4 of an inch of rain on that farm. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward and we talk about rain, because I'm going to come back to that. And then if you look down here, here's your accumulated rain for the past 7 days. It gives you expected evapotranspiration for the next 7 days. So what it's doing is looking at the weather forecast, looking at that ET curve that I just shared with you a few minutes ago, and it's telling you that you need to go ahead and plan that this is what your losses are going to be for the next 7 days. Okay, that's really critical with this, and I'm going to tell you why in just a second, why that is critical. The next 7 day ET. And then like here, I don't think that's right on this one. Whoever set the app up was probably not right, but you need to also put in the correct time. It's going to ask you the parameter to pressurize your system, right? You need to know that, especially if you're going to run fertigation too, right? We need to know what it takes to fill that system. So let's talk about data, and then we'll come back to how the app works. So I showed you I'm going to show you about 6 slides with some soil moisture sensor data on it, and then I want to talk about what we're seeing, what's going on. So this is Susie Blue variety done on one of our research farms. This is season-long data, so you can look at it and see what it looks like and how we irrigated using the app throughout. And I like the way this curve looks. So there's a bunch of things I could glean from this, but I want to point just 2 or 3 out from you. So sensors at 4, 8, and 12. So blue's 4. That purplish color is at 8, and that black color is at 12. So the first thing you notice is that we're not getting a ton of responses unless it's probably rainfall events anywhere deeper than 4 inches. Everybody see that? So that's right, we're seeing that straight up here. And we see a ton of oscillations here. That's our irrigation event. So what I did down here on the bottom is zoomed in for you. So you're not just seeing wavy lines. You're like, all right, what in the world's going on? So this is from June the 6th till June the 17th. So we're looking at about a 2-week time frame in the middle of that season. So does everybody see what's going on now? So you can see how we allow a dry down, and then there's a re-wet. We go up a dry down, a re-wet, a dry down, and then a re-wet. Up and down it oscillates. So that's all you're seeing here. And you notice here that we're pretty much staying saturated, to be honest, below that root zone. But what does that also tell you in these particular crops? Now these were, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I think these were about 3-year or 4-year-old bushes at the time. No water use down there, right? We didn't have active root systems down much deeper at that time. They were younger bushes, not extracting water. So we see that here. We don't see a lot of water use here, and we see saturation staying there. But what I also see is in my drip lines, the way we're running them here, do you see any profile flushing happening either? No, you're not seeing it infiltrate down that deep, which is perfect. That's where we want it to sit. So that's with the app. Again, scheduling with the app. Here's a 10 kilopascal trigger, and you might say, why did you pick that? Well, we looked at, we're on a sandy bed, pine bark mixed in, where do we think we need to be? The graph overall looks fairly similar. When you look through the season, there's a little bit of differences in there. Probably that 10 kilopascal, to be honest, got a little wet here after we picked the fruit, didn't it? Looked like to me we probably got some rainfall, and then we just kept irrigating it. We probably kept it too wet somewhere in here. That's what I see. But when you zoom in here around that same time frame in June, that middle week of June, to me this is a very pretty graph. This is what we want to see. We see a dry, wet, a dry, wet, a dry, wet cycle throughout that week. That's basically a very quintessential pulse and irrigation, and if y'all have ever monitored with sensors and looked at it. Again, maybe I should have turned that threshold a little bit higher, maybe closer to 15, maybe closer to 20, but we had estimated in that first year to see where we're at, and I think we were pretty close. All right, this is, to me, what I don't like. This is how, on this particular farm, and maybe, I don't know if anybody's doing it or not, but I feel like some of our growers sometimes are irrigating. They just say, hey, I'm going to put out an inch a week. I come in on Monday morning, I'm turning the system on, and I'm letting it run an inch. I'm getting my requirement out there, and then maybe peak season, I'm going to let it run an inch and a half on Monday, and then I walk away from it. Hopefully we all know that's not the way we need to manage irrigation, right? I see head shaking yes. And so this slide to me does a great job at showing me why that is. So let's look at that for a minute. They ran it on Mondays for an inch. So what do you notice that's different here? So one, I do start to see water use down deeper. So what that's also telling me, we dried it out and that our crop roots are extracting deeper. So maybe we had roots just before they didn't need to extract deeper. I see larger swings in general across my soil moisture sensor information. And then the other thing that I start to see is I even see leveling off of my deeper sensors showing that I'm getting pretty dry. And then notice that over this week time frame, and we can go back up here and look here too, it happened in June, and then it happened really bad in July and again in September. But what happened to my 4-inch sensor depth? And as I go up, it gets drier, right? Everybody's followed that the whole time. I dried it. And what did I do with that inch on Mondays? Did I ever recover it in those time frames without rainfall? I never recovered it. So what did I do to those plants by doing a 1-inch event one time a week? Even though we're meeting the demand of the plant, I put them in crop stress, didn't I? So if I'm just putting it out in one big shot or even a couple of big shots throughout the week without microdosing it, I think I'm showing that I'm pushing this plant into stress more times than I would like. I wouldn't want to be doing that on a regular basis. All right, look at a different variety. So that was Susie Blue, and we did Vernon at this particular site. Here's the app again. I see a little bit of different interactions deeper with this particular variety, and I can't remember the age, if they were planted at the same time or they're maybe about a year off. When I zoom in, it still looks fairly similar. I'm keeping it relatively wet where I feel like I need to be on those berries, moist in that bed. I see a little bit of interaction down a little bit deep, but none significant, and I'm not keeping it oversaturated. I'm happy still with the performance of the app there. Here's the 10 kilopascal trigger. Man, it looks a lot like that other slide I shared with y'all, didn't he? Up and down, up and down, up and down. And you can see the oscillations here. What do you notice with this other variety is I do see a lot more water use at the 4 and 8. And again, it may have been a year older, had roots deeper, but I like these oscillations. It's drying out, we're giving it water, drying out, giving it water about every day. And so I think that's what you want to do. And then that also helps maintain a more equal moisture throughout the entire season. Like, to me, these are beautiful graphs that we're keeping that in a really optimal range. How about here? Right, the 1 inch per week again, it's the same story, right? We drive this plant into plant stress a lot of times, and we're causing it to even dry out the deeper sensors here with deeper root depth. So by doing that 1 inch per week, where we get to a point, and what happens, and it's hard to tell since I didn't graph rainfall in here, what happens is we don't recover this. If you notice, this is from July 2nd until about July the 16th or 17th, that this one is sitting up here this high, and that soil type, that's dry. So our irrigation events at that point are not replenishing the soil. Does everybody follow what I'm telling you with that? So that tells me that once I've dried that out in that sand bed, especially that pine bark sand bed that I'm not able to replenish with this particular method. Even though I'm putting that inch on at a time, it's basically ineffective for me at that time, and I'm causing crop stress, and I'm assuming yield loss. And also, to me, the variability in moisture in that bed is probably going to cause some fruit quality issues over time, especially if I'm trying to do anything with fertigation or moisture management. So again, I think we learned a lot using the sensors on these beds and looking at the interactions, looking at how that app performs, looking at how the sensors perform. To me, looking at it, They look like they both perform equally well. Look like they did good from the soil moisture perspective. And so let's talk about it one more time to reiterate. The app predicts the evapotranspiration for the next 7 days. I mentioned that earlier. It recommends the ETC for the next 7 days. So it tells you, here's what you're going to lose. This is your recommendation and what you need to replace. However, here's the one, it's not a fallacy with the app, but the one little issue that if you download it, you start using it, because I've gotten these questions from growers before. They said, hey, it just rained 1.5 inches at my farm. The app's still telling me to irrigate. This, in the Blueberry app compared to a row crop app, the row crop app automatically minuses the rainfall off for you. Automatically does it. The Blueberry app does not do that. It tells you that you need to determine how you want to account for it in your run time. Does everybody follow that? So it tells you how much rainfall you got, and it says we recommend over the next 5 days you should irrigate this much. That's total irrigation. So that's why it's critical, that first slide. I said that's rainfall plus irrigation. So it's up to you to say, here's my irrigation cycle. I want to turn it off today, or I'm going to wait 3 days or whatever. It doesn't do those parts for you. That's on you. All right? So that's the one little bit difference that it does. Again, it's available for download, and honestly, if you look at it, we made the comment, it eliminates the use of guesswork with the timers and soil moisture sensors. You really may not need, I'm not telling you, if you want to use sensors, please use them, especially if you're doing fertigation and you want to get really in-depth in your management. But if you want to take a step beyond just irrigating a couple times per week and try to a little bit better manage it, this app's a really good tool, and all the apps are really good at record keeping. You can export a log at the end of the year on every irrigation event, rainfall event, water deficit, all that on them. So it's a nice record keeping tool for you too if you don't do that right now. So with that, that's just a good intro to it. Like I said, I think we're hoping to pick this work up and revamp it in the next few years. So does anybody have any questions for me real quick? Zach's coming up to run me off the stage. All right, I'll answer those two. So define stress. So in this case, how I would define stress from my perspective, I'm an engineer, so not a physiologist, right? So I'm not looking at it as much in the plant, but I know what my threshold needs to be on my sensor in a soil type, and I know that if I allow that sensor to go out of that threshold, that I am at the point that my crop can no longer readily extract water. Does that make sense? So I know that's how I'm defining stress here. I know that when I reach in this sandy soil, and I could show you a little bit deeper into some of these sensor graphs how I know that and how I look at it, but there's a lot of science that goes into them, and you see how the plant responses are. But in this particular case, once I get above about 15 kilopascals in this sandy soil type, now if you have a different soil type, you and I can talk about that on where it's going to be, but I know that I push that plant most likely into stress. So it's going to try to extract water, but it's going to have to work a lot harder, and the longer it stays in that, it's going to put more energy into extracting water and not able to have readily available water, I would say, and so it's going to sit in a stress, what I would call a stress state. Now, from the fertility perspective, in this particular study, we did not monitor that. I don't know how I would, there's a bunch of ways I could answer that depending on what we were looking at, and we can talk more about that if you'd like. I would say here, I think we were all right mostly from the fertility perspective because we didn't see any profile flushing. If we saw profile flushing, I would be a lot more worried about it, or sitting in extreme saturation. I think just drying out, if you're doing fertigation or something, you may run into the issue that if you got a dry bed and your water movement's not there, you're not getting fertility to the plant like you would like to. Does that make sense? You know, when you dry it out and you're not getting the water movement laterally across that bed anymore, I think you could see issues, fertility stress at that point. So good question though. You got your third one or no? All right, and then I'm coming to you.
Is good for blueberries? In other words, you went through a period of time and you saw the sugar or sucrose or glucose.
So I have personally not on blueberries, but I've done that on other crops. Most of my appointment I focus predominantly on row crops, and I can sit here and tell you that most of our row crops, there's optimal times that we need to stress them just a little bit, and I have to be really careful. And Zach walked around and asked questions. I told him yesterday we talked about plant stress, and I don't like using the term stress because it's supposed to have a negative connotation, but we do have to manage our crops with soil moisture to a certain level of appropriate stress for those exact reasons. Now, from the blueberry perspective, I can't speak exactly to it, but from general perspective, I know physiologically most of our crops require that appropriate amount of stress at the right time to cause some trigger to happen. So I would agree with that. We've not done that work, but if that's something that's critical, maybe that's something we should look into.
Sugar levels go up and they do their purpose.
I believe that to see, because it's switching modes for a certain reason. Yes. Okay. Yeah, I can get with you after this.
What sensors do you use, or what would you recommend?
So in this particular case, we were using just barometer watermark sensors. Now be careful, I will tell you to be careful if you get in extremely, extremely sandy scenarios. Watermarks do get hard to use. If it depends on what your goal is too, I guess I would say. If you're wanting to look at more fertigation management too, I would encourage you to look at some of the capacitance sensors that have EC tracking on them so that you can see that fertilizer movement. Now, I say that you're not going to be able to know exact fertility levels, right? So don't think that I'm telling you that, but what you see, if you're seeing spikes in EC that move below the root zone of your crop, or are not moving into the exact root zone of your crop, that means that you need to change your management strategy. So that's a really powerful tool with capacitance sensors that we have with that EC tracking on those that we can do. So it just depends on what you want to do with those. The watermark sensors are a little cheaper usually, and but what I would say is what do you have any local dealers around that have some stuff? I would explore them, look at some of the cost, and see if we can figure something out. So good question. All right, you can get off the stage.
We have Ed Moore with Sunmark Foods, and he's going to give us a presentation on the frozen food landmarks, the blueberry industry trends, and blueberry industry challenges. So let's go.
This is the device right
Yep. Any pointers? Ready.
Thank you, Zach. When I was first asked to come and speak, they weren't telling me which commodity I was going to speak on. And about 30 seconds into the conversation, they mentioned blueberries, and I said, I'm all in. Because once we get through this presentation today, you're going to learn that within the frozen fruit category, blueberries are the biggest opportunity right now in our industry. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick history lesson of the last 20 years. We're going to go through that pretty quick because I want to get to the end of the presentation to talk about what's happening today in the frozen blueberry category, so we'll be all educated in that regard. All right, so going back in time, where do we see things happening about 20 years ago? We had some significant landmarks in the frozen fruit industry that really changed the entire industry, and started with the Dole company. Dole Foods entered into the frozen fruit commodity group, and it actually became the first national brand that was around. And not only just any national brand, but Dole being one of the most powerful names in the entire produce industry. That was a big landmark. Secondly, went with that entrance, the awareness of quality, the flavor of the fruit, micro testing, all these elements of quality became elevated at that time. Another development that took place back around 20 years ago was the development of the stand-up pouch. And if you know, when you go shopping in a grocery store 30, 40, 50 years ago, you'd see that little poly bag just laying there. It didn't do much from a marketing perspective, but the stand-up pouch really changed how the consumer viewed frozen fruits. The next thing that happened, and this is more on the processor side, the traditional blast freezer, where you would take your fruit and freeze it, was slowly being replaced by IQF tunnels. And IQF tunnels became the norm of converting fresh to frozen. And with those IQF tunnels, you got exceedingly higher productivity. So you could, instead of taking a week to take a case frozen blueberry and put it in a freezer and freeze it, you could literally freeze those blueberries in 7 minutes. Another thing that happened is that smoothies became well established as a consumption medium for consumers, whether that was a smoothie that you made at home or a smoothie that you would go out and purchase. I remember going to lunch many times like, hey, I'm going to go get a burger. No, I'm going to go get a smoothie today. And that was something that became part of our culture. And that was established mostly by Smoothie King and Jamba Juice. Again, in the early 2000s, they went by, but the combination of those two chains, you had 1,000 of those outlets throughout the United States. So all of these things, I got my little stage up there, they really set the stage for what happened in the frozen industry, and it was a big explosion. We enjoyed the most expansion in our industry in the years 2006 to 2012. Our industry was growing at higher than double-digit growth rates every single year. And it was all these elements that contributed to that explosive growth. And blueberries were a big part of that. All right, now fast forward now to the 2010s, and what kind of things happened to our industry in that time? Well, we started to see a little bit more of price sensitivity. The excitement of quality and the stand-up pouch and the Dole brand and all these other elements that were supporting the growth, we started to see, specifically in the retail side, not as much food service, but in the retail channels, we started to see some price pressure coming in. Another element that came into our industry was the packet source, where when the products were internationally sourced, typically they would come into the United States in a 30-pound bulk package, and then they'd be put in that retail bag somewhere here in the US or Canada. Well, what we started to see in the last 10 years was a trend where those retail poly bags, those stand-up pouches, instead of those being packaged right here in the US, we started to see a trend where that was happening internationally, whether it was in Chile, Peru, and other countries. The overall consumption growth of that we loved and enjoyed in 2006 through 2012, it actually started to slow down a little bit. The double-digit growth that we had and had experienced was now coming back down to more of a single digit. And the other thing, and this is something that we'll touch on later, is we started to see some radical price swings. If you go back in time, if you had a 3 or 4 cent per pound change in the raw material price, people would be freaking out. 3 or 4 cents a pound, oh my gosh. Well, now we're in a day and age where we see price swings that are as much as 100%. And that's definitely something that we'd never experienced in this industry before. Another call out here, another landmark is what's happening in Peru. In the southern hemisphere, Chile has historically been that place where a lot of frozen fruit was produced. Well, for sure, over the last 10 years, Peru has become a major player. And they're a major player in 3 of the bigger commodities: strawberries, blueberries, and of course, mango. Let's move on here to the next. So what's happening today? And this is kind of anecdotal, but blueberries have now formally established themselves as a number 2 frozen commodity. And we're definitely going to talk about this a little bit later, but what's happened here, if you go back 10, 20, 30 years, frozen strawberries have been the marquee frozen commodity for years and years. And what we're seeing now is an erosion of that number 1 position. So strawberries consumption is coming down. And at the same time, blueberries have separated themselves from the pack. And the pack, I mean pineapple, peach, and mango. Those 4 commodities, including blueberries, were always kind of trying to jockey themselves for that number 2 spot. Well, blueberries are now clearly number 2. Other things, so we'll go through these quick. Dragon fruit, right now, it's the fastest growing frozen commodity. Well, why is that? Well, because there was no frozen dragon fruit 5 years ago. That's an easy expansion. The next thing we saw was a lot of avocado. A lot of frozen avocados started showing up in the markets. The restaurants were big users of frozen avocado because it saved a tremendous amount of labor. The peeling, the ripening, the disposal of the seed, the waste was all eliminated by frozen. But that's kind of stalled right now. If you've seen a lot of the Chipotle commercials on TV where they're just pushing the fact that all of our avocados are fresh. Well, with Chipotle pushing that into the market, and as that's the messaging, the frozen avocado has slowed down because of that specifically. The next thing to mention is dark sweet cherries becoming more prevalent around. I don't know if you've ever had a frozen dark sweet cherry, but within our industry, it's the candy of the frozen fruit industry. It's just a spectacular piece of fruit. And I believe even Costco has rolled out a nationwide program on dark sweet cherries. Another thing that's happening today, just as a call out, is the raspberries in Chile. They're dealing with some significant larva issues. The fact of the matter is, Chile's got 1,700 small raspberry growers. So getting all of those 1,600 or 1,700 people to use the right pesticides and the insecticides and educate them properly it's very difficult, if not impossible. And then getting back to the industry growth, like I mentioned, the double-digit growth that we were experiencing from 2006 to 2012 definitely has slowed. And right now, the industry is calling out for a 4% growth of frozen fruits. One other mention, since we're talking blueberries, wild blueberries have primarily been grown in 3 locations: Maine, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. And what we're seeing in today's expansion is New Brunswick is coming online in a big way, and New Brunswick will ultimately catch up at minimum to Quebec. Okay, so I'm going to start slowing down a little bit as these bolds pick up, because it's going to start applying a lot more to what we're talking about with blueberries. One of the things we're also seeing is a price spread between high quality and low quality. So as a grower, it is going to be in your best interest to strive to have the highest quality coming out of your fields. And that's just because of the spread that has taken place today in our market. And really what ultimately happens is when you have a high market price, you want to be able to capitalize on that high market price and not have to sell the secondary quality. And then the opposite's true on the other end of the spectrum. When the market price goes down, you definitely don't want to be selling at a cost which will never hit your break even on a low market. The next call out is to mention on strawberries, and hopefully no offense to any strawberry growers in the room, but the realities, these are the realities. On the frozen side, we are seeing a decline in flavor. As strawberries are being cultivated more for color, size, and shelf life, they are taking a few steps back on the flavor side. And that was fully manifest to me by one of my kids who came to me and said, "Hey Dad, what the heck's going on with these strawberries? They're like apples. They're big and they're red and they're crunchy." And unfortunately, on the frozen side, the raw material that is flowing into our industry we've seen that flavor reduction. Other things to point out that's happening in the frozen side, we're seeing some unique fruits show up. We're seeing things like dragon fruit, we mentioned, acai, citruses even flowing in, passion fruit cubes, and then other ingredients are finding their way in the frozen category, like chia, flax, whey protein, etc. These are all becoming additive ingredients into different smoothie packs. And also we're seeing a resurgence of chocolate-covered frozen fruits. And this is something that was a big deal about 20 years ago, kind of faded, died away, and now some of those are even coming back. And the last thing to mention about current trends is the single servings. A lot of single serving offerings, more and more in our frozen category. All right, so now we're kind of getting to some of the heart of what I really want to share today. And again, reflecting that blueberries are firmly established as that #2 frozen commodity. And I do see this as #2, but I also see it as it's going to continue to expand. One other call out, blueberry acreage in Peru. They're coming on big time, and this year is the very first year that there are more acres of blueberries in the ground in Peru than even in Chile. The next thing to mention about the Chileans is they are actually pulling some blueberries out. And why are they doing that? Well, quite honestly, the Chinese have discovered that fresh, dark, sweet cherries are incredible. And so these blueberry growers are taking advantage of that demand that's right from China for fresh. They're pulling their blueberries out, and they're putting dark, sweet cherries in to go fresh. The next thing to mention is the transition, and this is just about everywhere. Anywhere blueberries are going in, they are being planted in such a way so that they can be mechanically harvested. And the driver there, trying to save labor. And it doesn't matter if it's in Chile, it doesn't matter if it's in the Northwest or British Columbia. The industry is trying to find ways to do more mechanical harvesting. Another call out here is what's happening in the Northwest with this Calypso variety, and I guess that's something that some of the other speakers could talk about. But from a marketing perspective, what is this going to mean for us as an industry? Well, over 50% of the Northwest varieties are Duke, over 50%. And as a result, there's a massive harvest time in those windows when those Duke varieties are coming off. And almost every year, year in and year out, that harvest will flood the fresh market, the price will drop, and then all those blueberries on the raw side, they start going to frozen. What's going to happen as this Calypso variety comes on is you're going to see that peak production of Dukes drop slightly, and then you're going to see a new peak evolve with this Calypso variety. That's going to have an interesting effect on frozen, because instead of that time where you get this flood of inbound products, it's going to kind of decline. So we're going to have to watch and pay special attention to how that Calypso impacts our markets. The last thing we mentioned here is that the projection of the frozen industry it's projected to grow about 4%. Those numbers should become real here from 2023 in the next few weeks. We'll see if that's really true. But the thing to call out is that that projected growth is led by berries, and that's at 7%. All right, so this is the last slide, and really where I'd like to leave you guys today, and then we'll do some question and answers. One of the issues in the frozen industry is how the retailers do their price mechanisms. As you know, in fresh, prices can change every couple weeks. In frozen, this is just not the reality. In frozen, most retailers do their pricing once a year. So the function of supply and demand and price changes, they don't flow very well on the frozen side. So as a result of that, what do you see? What have we started to see? Big price swings in the frozen world because the economics just aren't working freely and flowing like they are in fresh. When there's a lot of fresh, you drop the price and there's a lot of consumption. Frozen, you don't get that mechanism, and that's just something to be aware of as a grower. We talked about radical price swings, and then of course the Peru impact. This is an interesting concept because as Peru becomes more and more a player in our world today, we don't really know where their target is. Right now, they're 100% sending their fruit here. They are dependent on the US. That could change over time as they develop markets around the world, but we don't know that yet, and that's, I guess, what I want to contrast. Where Peru is solely dependent on the US, Chile has developed markets all over the world. So if Chile finds out that we can sell our blueberries to Australia for more than we can sell them here, you don't see those frozen Chilean berries here in the US that year. They're somewhere else. Peru hasn't quite gotten there yet. So we just need to be watching how they're doing their marketing to see how it impacts our markets. Talking about producing more high quality fruit, we talked about that a little bit already. We really want to focus on producing high quality berries, and that's going to ultimately improve your returns and avoid selling into the substandard markets where the returns are not as high. Whether the markets are high or low, you've got to focus on that higher quality fruit. This is definitely a change from something that I probably would have said 10 or 20 years ago, is that you've got to have both outlets as part of your sales plan. You can no longer just be a frozen grower. Someone who grows blueberry, we're going to put blueberries in the ground and we're going to grow them just for frozen. We can't do that anymore. And the same is true for fresh. We can't just be a fresh seller of blueberries in today's market. And it's because of the market swings that are out there today. So as far as a ratio, it doesn't really matter. You just can't be all in either market. So today, if you're an all fresh, I'd strongly encourage you to develop a frozen outlet. And the opposite's true. If you're 100% growing for frozen, I'd strongly advise that you develop at least a portion of your crop to fresh or frozen. So, and then every year, I would move that back and forth around between 10 and 20%, depending on the market. One year, your fresh market's going to be really high and going strong. Maybe tweak that channel a little bit higher by 10 or 20% and pull back your frozen. And then the opposite true. Years you're going to have a really hot frozen market. And in that year, maybe tweak your channeling of your product towards frozen. And the last part, and this is probably the most exciting thing I want to leave you with, and then we'll do some questions. Right now, blueberries are on their way to becoming the #1 frozen fruit item. They're on their way. And I'm going to stand maybe one day, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I know who knows how long into the future. But I'm going to tell you, this is going to happen. We can already see it happening. Today, strawberries are 37% of frozen and blueberries are 23%. 10, 20, 30 years ago, strawberries were way above 50% of where we are today, and blueberries weren't even at 20. It's happening. So #1, the blueberries have separated themselves, like I said. They're separated from mango, they're separated from pineapple, they're separated from peaches. They've moved into that #2 spot, and strawberries, the gap is closing. I was in a meeting just this week with one of the major retailers, and just to give you an insight to the future, this company is very progressive. They sell more frozen fruit per customer than any other retailer in the United States. And I actually shared this projection with him in a meeting this week. And you know what he responded? He said, well, let me not only say burst your bubble, but tell you you've already achieved it. Actually, in 2022, we are actually selling more frozen blueberries in our grocery stores than any other frozen fruit. So the future is actually already playing out in one of the major retailers in the United States. We'll leave his name unmentioned. So anyway, perfect. With that, we've got 5 minutes, so we can just kind of pause and open this for questions. I'll turn this on and give this to Zach. Test. There we go. All right, there we go. Great, thanks. All right, if you got a question, just throw your hand up, and they want to try and use the mic if we can. If not, we'll wrap up over on the left side. So there's more people on that side than this side.
Good morning. Being new to blueberry, when you talk about a grower planning to be in both frozen and fresh, are there varietal differences that are more appropriate for fresh market than for frozen market? And would that be an issue?
Yep. So I would say it's a minor issue. And why would I say it's minor? And specifically for this group, because there's a lot of Southeast, there is some sensitivity in frozen to rabbit eye varieties. There have been some customers, different pockets of the United States, that would say that a frozen rabbit eye is a little bit chewier, sometimes it's a little seedy, but that's a very minimalistic comment. So I would say it's a slight concern, but not a big one. Yes, sir.
If I may continue. So the story that you told us about the strawberry, so the strawberry kind of is killing itself because of the flavor you mentioned. So again, talking about the rabbit eye, could that be happen in the future in terms of the quality of the flavor?
Yeah, quite interesting about the rabbit eye flavor, the dynamics between that flavor testing that you see between a rabbit eye and maybe, if you want to call it the high bush, those dynamics do not play themselves out in the fresh side. You never hear the consumer. So when consumers are eating that rabbit eye, it's an enjoyable eating experience. And the same is true with frozen 95% of the time. Right.
You seeing much pushback on mechanical harvesting in the fresh market?
Only from the grower or harvester perspective, because the mechanical harvesting is not perfected. And quite honestly, there's a significant amount of loss. And I'm going to say right now, you're going to lose at least 10 to 15% of your fruit that stays on the ground. So the pushback is not from the retailers or the food service companies. It's literally making the dollars work so you don't lose it in the fields.
If we're in a area of the blueberry growing area that doesn't really have any IQF or any kind of frozen facilities, and so your suggestion of getting part frozen. I mean, we have a lot of we'll have a lot of stuff that would go to frozen, but it's not. Is there any do you have any ideas about that?
Right. So the areas or regions, if you will, that do not have a proliferation of IQF tunnels, case frozen blueberries are still part of our industry. In fact, the vast majority of Michigan blueberries, which Michigan's still a pretty big player in the blueberry world, the vast majority of frozen Michigan blueberries are case frozen. So yeah, that still is part of the trade. Oh, that's okay. That's going to be more difficult. So what you'd probably have to do is partner with someone in Georgia to have your berries, or at least portions of them, brought up here for IQF processing.
What's the shelf life of frozen?
In generalistic terms, most frozen fruit has a shelf life of 2 years. There's a couple exceptions. Maybe grapes would be one, and bananas would be another. That would be only about a year or 9 months, but for the most part, it's 2 years, 2 year shelf life. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. That's good. Okay, appreciate it.
Okay. It didn't look like too many folks. I will say, if you can download the app for the scheduling, I think there may have been a mix-up or error in the hardback paper copy handouts of the schedules, but the schedule on the app is correct. And with that, we will introduce the next speaker, Gerardo Nunez from the University of Florida. He's going to be giving us a presentation on the southern highbush response to phosphorus deficiencies.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to switch topics a little bit, and for the next few minutes, we're going to be talking about phosphorus nutrition in blueberry. And this is a topic that has emerged as a big priority in my research group at the University of Florida, because we believe there's a lot here that is misunderstood and unknown, and we believe we can make some important contributions here, considering, of course, that this research started right around 2020 when the fertilizer prices were at an all-time high. So we started thinking of ways in which we can reduce the fertilizer use for the benefit of the grower, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't spending copious amounts of money in putting fertilizer that was not ending up inside the plant. So when we start thinking about growing blueberries, traditionally in our region, we're talking about a very unique growing system. It's a growing system in which the plants are neither growing hydroponically fully in pine bark, nor growing fully in soil, but actually growing in both. And in most locations, we're going to find a mix of sand or soil, depending on where you are, and also pine bark. And this mix is quite unique, because what we are going to find is that the soil components usually get us to a pH that is a little bit higher than the optimum for blueberry. You're going to get native soils, if you're down in Florida, sometimes even up to pHs of 7. And if you're moving more towards the continental United States in the southeast, you will find soils in the 6s, which might still be a little bit high. Those soils tend to be very rich in phosphorus, but that phosphorus is tightly bound to calcium. So traditionally, our soil test result is going to read high phosphorus, high calcium, and those are going to be together in really stable molecules. And finally, of course, we're going to have the addition of the pine bark. Pine bark or any other organic matter you may be adding, whether it is coming from manures, coming from pine bark, or even the liquid organic matter sources that we're using so much of nowadays, like humic acid and fulvic acid. What those are doing is they're getting into your soil, and they are lining the soil with negative charges. And those negative charges are going to be the enemy here, because the main form in which plants take up phosphorus is going to be as phosphates. Now, the phosphate has a negative charge. The soil organic matter has a negative charge on its own. Unfortunately, those two negative charges repel one another. So what we see is that we have a system in which the phosphorus is going to be either tightly bound to the calcium or highly mobile and able to leach. That's, of course, going to be a little bit of a problem. When we think about phosphorus, therefore, there are going to be 3 different places or 3 different pools in the soil where we find phosphorus. And those pools are going to be quite different, because we have full control over one, less control over the second, and absolutely no control over the third. First, let's talk about the dissolved phosphorus. The phosphorus that is in solution, as I mentioned, has a negative charge. It can be found in a number of different molecules, but generally what we have is that this is the phosphorus that came from the fertilizer, that came from the fertigation. That's what's readily available for the plant, and the plant will quickly take that up. We know that plant uptake of phosphorus happens throughout the roots, not just in the root tips, and it's going to occur really rapidly. That's the one that we have full control of. Unfortunately also, that's the one that's going to leach the fastest, because it is, as I mentioned, repelled by the soil organic matter. We have a second pool that is the adsorbed phosphorus. That's phosphorus that's being held around wherever there may be any positive charges in the soil. And what we know is that clays are going to play a particularly important role in holding onto that phosphorus. However, in most soils in the southeast, we don't find very high clay contents. So we don't expect to have lots of adsorbed phosphorus available for our system. And finally, we're going to have that mineral phosphorus. That's the phosphorus here in the phosphate attached to aluminum, iron, and calcium. All of those elements, of course, are highly abundant in our soils, so we had to keep in mind that they're going to be present. When we consider the three different pools of phosphorus, we have to keep in mind about plant availability. Phosphorus from fertilizer is readily available. Phosphorus that is adsorbed to the soil is a little less available. Finally, phosphorus from the mineral pool is entirely unavailable to the plant. The plant does not have a good ability to take that phosphorus because it is made into those really big molecules. And now, to complicate matters just a little bit further, we have to think about the mighty soil test. Depending on where you are in the Southeast, chances are you are soil testing with either MELIC 1 or MELIC 3 extractions. It really just depends on what the extension system in your state has calibrated that soil test to mean. And what we know is that both MELIC 1 and MELIC 3 are going to be relatively good at measuring the phosphorus from solution. They're going to be okay at measuring the phosphorus that is adsorbed. But there's big questions about whether they are actually adequate at measuring the mineral phosphorus. Depending on where you are, again, you might be using MELIC 1 or MELIC 3, and that will really depend. And on that, it will really depend whether you're getting a good read of your mineral phosphorus. With those two things in mind, now let's talk about how we're going to find phosphorus in our soil. Here along the x-axis, you are going to see pH. pH stretching from very acidic at around 4 and to more basic at around 8. Let's remember that the maximum availability of phosphorus is going to happen somewhere here in the middle, around 6.5 pH. And the reason phosphorus is mostly available to the plant in that pH is because that is the pH at which phosphorus neither makes complexes with calcium nor with aluminum. Now, as you can see there, of course, we're going to see a problem for blueberries, because for most blueberries, we're going to find that the optimum pH is actually found between 5 and 6. Therefore, we expect our blueberries to be really, really good at getting bound with iron and aluminum. And that's going to let us know that that phosphorus that is found in the soil is phosphorus that is being held very tightly by the plant. And how will the plant go about surviving in that environment? There's three possible alternatives of how the plant is going to pick up that phosphorus. First, it has to grow towards it. The phosphorus that is bound to aluminum and iron is not going to be mobile in our soil. So the plant has to literally grow a root next to that part of the soil, even will be able to pick it up. The second thing that the plant is going to do is it's going to have to exude molecules. We're going to see organic acids. We're going to see enzymes. The plant literally pumps those into the rhizosphere and uses that to make sure that it can come and start breaking those chemical bonds. The bonds of calcium, aluminum, iron, and of course the bonds of the organic matter. That's going to be a little bit costly for the plant because there is carbon and nitrogen in those molecules that are getting exuded. So the plant's actually incurring a cost to get that phosphorus in. Another way the plant can do it is, of course, outsource that. Let the fungus in the mycorrhiza go out and pick up the phosphorus and exchange that simply for carbon. Those are the main ways we see across the board from all plants about how they go on and find their phosphorus. And the more we read about it, the more we looked at the literature that was available, and we had a long time to do this as we were locked up, the more we realized that we know very little about how or if any of this is happening for blueberries. We don't know they're actually growing closer. We don't know what they exude or to what extent they exude any kinds of molecules, and we don't know how much they are actually associating with mycorrhiza in the soil. So we set up this objective to try to understand how our blueberry is going to respond to a phosphorus deficiency. We wanted to intentionally cause the deficiency to see if they were actually able to pick up some of those phosphorus molecules that we know are highly abundant in the soil. So the experiment was set up at the UF Plant Science Research and Education Unit. We used two different varieties, Sentinel and Optimus. These are some of the newer varieties coming out of the University of Florida breeding program. And we grew them in a randomized complete block design. That allowed us to take a close look at what those plants were growing in. Now, this is purely for research purposes. Nobody would do this practically in their farm. But what we did is we actually planted blueberries and fertilized them with 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. So there's plenty of nitrogen in there. We gave them potassium, calcium, everything else. The only thing that we were managing really narrowly was the phosphorus. And we had plants that had 0 pounds of phosphorus, so no phosphorus added from fertilization at all, going all the way to 60 pounds of phosphorus per acre per year. Now, phosphorus is a lot of fun, as you probably know already, Because in the fertilizer bag, you're not getting an idea of how much phosphorus you get. You are getting phosphate. So to translate that to phosphate, what we were looking at was ranges between 0 pounds of phosphate per acre per year, all the way out to 140 pounds of phosphate per acre per year. One more time, let's remember that this is all happening in the background with 200 pounds of nitrogen, so we know that those are going to be the ratios that we observe. When we put the plants in the ground, these were the conditions of the soil of planting. Our pH was a little bit higher than I wanted it. Cards on the table, I would have hoped that this was about a half a point lower for the varieties I was using. We had a classic Florida soil with a low cation exchange capacity, very low organic matter, and very high phosphorus. Notice that my soil was reading 157 milligrams of phosphorus per kilo of soil. So that's a pretty high soil. Usually we call anything higher than 45 pounds a high phosphorus soil. I am at 150, so there was plenty of phosphorus there. We put the plants on the ground in July. We didn't take leaves right away because they were really small plants at that time. But from that point on, starting in October, we started tracking how much phosphorus was available in those leaves. And as you can see, during the time that the plant was actively growing, in October, and then later on in January, we would clearly see the responses. When we gave the plants 0 pounds of phosphorus per acre per year, they had significantly lower phosphorus concentrations, and then when we gave them more phosphorus, they had higher phosphorus concentrations in those leaves. The red dotted line here represents the line that we traditionally consider deficiency, 0.12%. The same was true as those plants entered their first productive season. In Florida, we do harvest blueberries on the first year, so you have to bear with me here. But what we saw is that in March through May, which is when we were harvesting these plants, we actually one more time could tell that 0 phosphorus was definitely not adequate for those plants. They had lower leaf concentrations. Now things got really interesting after our prune, because after we prune these plants in May, we start regrowing the plant. As many of you do, what we're going to try is to rebuild the canopy so that we are able to have a good canopy for the crop for the next year. And that is when we usually recommend that we actually do some leaf testing to figure out if we need to amend, change, or increase our fertilization. Notably, during the summer months when we are regrowing our canopy in Florida, what we saw was that no matter how much phosphorus we gave, we generally had lower phosphorus concentrations in those leaves than was ideal. And this is the story about summer rain. I think it goes very, very well with the prior conversations we heard about irrigation. Because now what we start seeing is that even when we are putting 60 pounds of phosphorus per acre per year, which is equivalent to saying 140 pounds of phosphate per acre per year, those summer rains are the enemy. They are going to move that phosphate out of the rhizosphere very, very fast. And that's money literally going down the drain. We see, of course, that what we have to put our emphasis on for future years is to look at how do we make better fertilizer decisions through the summer, because the summer becomes a crucial time. There's so much water coming down from the rain that despite our best attempts at managing irrigation very technically, we see lots of that phosphorus is leaching out. Now, when we apply these different treatments, we were actually getting differences in concentration in the leaves, but we could not observe any differences on the plants. As you can see here, both of the varieties grew following more or less an exponential growth curve, but at no point throughout the first year of cultivation did we actually see a growth effect. We went back to the textbook and we had the opportunity to call out that when people tell you that a phosphorus deficiency leads to stunting, that is not accurate for a blueberry. Blueberries are plants that have some really, really strong homeostatic responses. They keep their homeostasis, they try to be very, very stable. So even in situations where they did not have enough phosphorus, they continue to grow at more or less the same rate. When we went ahead and did destructive harvest in the summer, one more time, no differences, no stunting. We saw both Sentinel and Optimus were growing at similar rates despite the amount of phosphorus that they were growing in. And that was a total head scratcher. And to tell you the truth, the biggest head scratcher was walking down the field. Because you could not tell that in that field there were 8 groups of plants that were not getting fertilized. That's what my field looked like in the middle of the summer. I'm actually kind of proud that it looked like that. for they are one-year-old plants, but you could not tell that some of these plants were not getting fertilized with phosphorus. And that's where the head scratcher comes in. If you're not fertilizing this plant, how can they get to the right size and the right shape, and what's happening altogether? We went ahead and, of course, harvested, and that's where things started coming together a little bit more for us. There were no significant differences in yield. Of course, we built plants of the same size, and in the plant of the same size, we saw similar yields. There were no significant differences in quality, but I'm not showing that data today in attention to time. But we got to thinking. These plants, for being at first year, were producing anywhere between 100 and 300 grams of berries per bush. That's not a very high yield, but again, you have to pardon me here, for it is year one. I hope you have the chance to be back here in future years and actually show you this field at full production, when hopefully I'm going to meet the standards of production that many of you have for your farms. But if I just took the median plant here and multiply that times 1,936, which is the average plant density we use in Florida, and then I kept in mind that inside the berry, there's phosphorus, I found out that for Optimus, I would be producing 426 pounds of berries per acre. For Sentinel, I would be producing about 1,000 pounds of berries per acre, which means that I would be removing from that field 3.37 kilos of phosphorus by the Optimus plants and 5.34 kilos of phosphorus by the Sentinel plants. The question becomes, if some of these plants did not get any fertilizer, where did the phosphorus come from? And the answer was, of course, back in the beginning, in the soil. We went right back at this field, tested 1 year after cultivation, and we tested at two different depths where we expect to find blueberry roots, 15 centimeters and 30 centimeters. And what we found was that there was a significant decline in phosphorus when the plants were not getting fertilized, so 0 pounds of phosphorus per acre, but also occasionally a significant decline when the plants were only getting 15 pounds of phosphorus per acre. This lets us know that even though in our year one results we did not see differences in growth or yield, what was happening was that the plants were picking up phosphorus straight from the soil. And now I will be the first person to tell you that blueberry roots are very delicate. Every single person in the room who has had a chance to dig, transplant, or move a blueberry plant knows that those really fine roots don't really do a whole lot in the soil. But what we're finding here is that these roots are actually chemically extracting some of that phosphorus from the soil. This is our first evidence that that's actually working in our plants. So we had three main lessons that we learned from our first field season. And I always like to annotate that this is our first field season, right? We are going to continue doing this in the future to make sure that we see these patterns over and over so that we can actually make some solid conclusions. But the first one is that, to our surprise, blueberry roots are in fact able to mine phosphorus from the soil. And these are traditional Florida soils that are going to have calcium and phosphorus and aluminum and iron. We also saw that phosphorus fertilization rates did not lead to many above ground symptoms. We did not see stunting. We did not see those red colors that we traditionally associate with a phosphorus deficiency. So that makes our ability to track the deficiency just a little bit harder. And finally, we saw that summer rains become a major challenge in terms of phosphorus management for our plants. We have to find better ways, and we're proposing now research to different agencies to hopefully try to get better at our summer fertilization. That's a critical time for us. After the prune, we want to regrow the plant. That, of course, gives us very high nutrient demands coming from the plant, and we want to make sure that every single pound of fertilizer we pay for ends up inside the plant. We are losing money if everything is just leaching through, as our data suggests. Our ongoing work is, of course, planning for a 2024 and eventually our 2025 season, where we're going to be repeating these treatments. I do not expect plants that have 0 phosphorus for multiple years to actually have similar responses. We're actually going to see some deficiencies and limitations. I want to be able to document that because I think that's really important for us. And just to wrap up, I want to acknowledge my collaborators. Much of this work is done by Marlon Retana, who's my graduate student, with help from my technician, who's Dylan Kovac. And the work I'm doing here and presenting is all funded by the Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services. With that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
In your example, you have pH, your typical pH is 6.5 or 6.60, and typically, you know, like our pH is down in the low 4s. And are you gonna, you know, I think it's more typical to see low 4s unless you have a lot of deep well irrigation. It's a lot of growers acidify their soils and everything. Are you planning to lower the soil pH to get a more similar to commercial fields? And also, if phosphorus is being pulled out of the roots by blueberries that are not typical phosphate compounds, obviously they're the ones that are more tightly tied up, do you consider trying any experimentation with some of those other compounds as a fertilizer source rather than typical, you know, phosphates?
So there are two questions, one about the pH management. We did, in fact, do sulfur applications essentially right after the soil test results to drop the pH lower, and we do yearly sulfur applications. My target has usually been to be on average, right? We take many subsamples in the acre. My target has usually been to be at around pH of 5.5. As you know, that's going to drift through the season up and down, but that's generally where I want to see it. I have seen very successful farms at pHs closer to 6, and also very successful farms at pHs closer to 4. It's just for the two varieties that I'm using in a field that we have some history with cultivating blueberries in the research farm of the university. We try to keep it at 5.5. That seems to work best for our results. I want to make a quick comment about your pH, because I assume you're not the only person here that has a soil pH that's lower than 5.5, maybe perhaps at 5 or one in the high 4s. What's happening here, and something that to me is very unique, is that at those lower pHs, you can expect that the phosphorus is tightly bound with iron. Now, when the plant goes out there and puts an enzyme that breaks that bond, your plant just actually got two wins out of it, because it got a win for taking phosphorus, which it needs, but also it has now freed up iron. And this is why at your lower pH soils, you rarely ever see iron deficiencies, which is why that those of us that struggle with the 6 and maybe the 6.5s, we actually tend to see the iron deficiencies more often. Now, it becomes much more of a challenge when what you have in your soil is phosphorus bound to aluminum, because that act of freeing up the phosphates for plant uptake releases the aluminum. And this is where we're starting to see in some of the low pH soils, sometimes aluminum toxicity. The final question about additional sources of phosphorus. At this point, all we are using is phosphates, because we want to get an idea of what is the deficiency response. And once we have it properly documented, I believe we will be in a good place to start testing other sources, because otherwise it does feel like I'm looking for the needle in the haystack, because these plants are not getting red, they're not getting stunted, they're not growing bigger root systems. So I want to have a chance to properly describe what is a phosphorus deficient blueberry, so that then I can say, hey, avoid the deficiency with any number of sources.
Is the phosphorus level staying up in the soil? Because you started, it was at 165 when you started, which is a huge amount of phosphorus in the soil. Is it dropping pretty fast?
It's dropping. It has dropped significantly in the bed, right, where we test. It has dropped significantly on year 1 already. I foresee that as we keep going, that's going to drop to a level that's low enough that the plants that are not getting fertilized are going to start showing you the deficiency.
New Jersey, their base recommendation for blueberries is 60, 60, 60 on an annual basis. What in Florida are you basically looking at as a recommendation for blueberries with the phosphorus levels?
We don't yet have a recommendation in Florida, and part of the goals in this work is to figure out what is the right recommendation for us. We have seen recommendations in other states. There's one here in Georgia, and I think, don't let me lie, folks, several folks in Florida actually consider that recommendation a very good baseline, but we don't have a formal recommendation at this time.
What's that baseline one in Georgia then?
Sorry?
What's the baseline for phosphorus in Georgia then?
The baseline for phosphorus in Georgia. I don't want to misquote this, but I want to say at a minimum it's 30 pounds of
All right,
phosphate.
I wanted you
per year.
to say that because up in the Chesapeake Bay region, they're very concerned how much phosphorus is going into the bay. And we have for strawberries, plastic culture, no matter what the phosphorus testing, how high it is or over, we have a recommendation of 30 pounds of phosphorus. And I'd like to make that same, and I made that recommendation at the university, I'd like to make the same one for blueberries at a base level of 30 pounds. I came 700 miles to hear your talk, and I sort of looked at the slide up there, and it looks like 30 pounds may be something you'd want to hit in on after your work's done, but I just wanted to see what you say to that.
No problem. That's why we're doing the work. I think a lot of what we're trying to do, and I've had an opportunity to talk to several growers in Florida about this. When we do this nutrient research, that of course for research purposes has to have a 0 or has to have a very low number, half of the work we're trying to do is to educate the regulator. Like half of the time, half of the outcomes, actually in my case, end up at the Florida Department of Agricultural and Consumer Services. And I've had the good fortune of bringing them into the farm and showing them what it looks like. Because it's really easy sometimes behind a keyboard to say 0 phosphorus or low phosphorus. But when they walk the farm and when they see what we are doing and when they see the amount of care we put into the fertilizer we apply, they realize that it's a very different business.
Do you know the mechanism yet for why the plant can take the phosphorus from these soils?
We have complementary work. It hasn't been done on the farm. It's still yet at the hydroponic level. What we're seeing is that these plants are putting out a lot of organic acids. So they exude the organic acid. The organic acid has a very high affinity for aluminum. So it breaks that molecule by binding to the aluminum, and now the phosphate's free for the plant. We haven't done any microbe work. That's not specifically in my wheelhouse. But if anybody in the room wants to collaborate on that, I'm happy to do it. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
So just a few reminders. Download the fruit and vegetable app, the SE Regional, in the App Store, Google Play. Our next speaker was unable to attend in person, but we do have her recording, and she's going to join us later for the Q&A.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Amanda Davis, and I'm a faculty research assistant at Oregon State University. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today about some of the successful blueberry practices that we use here in the Northwest that may be able to be transferred to the Southeast region as well. A little overview of our industry in the Pacific Northwest. In Oregon, we have about 13,200 acres of blueberries, and we typically get a yield of about 6 tons per acre. Around 40% of our fruit goes to the fresh market, and about 60% of it is processed into frozen and other puree juice products. In Washington, they have more acres, about 22,000 acres, with an average yield of about 4 tons per acre. And for Washington, 30% of the fruit goes fresh, and about 70% is processed. So in our area, machine harvest is quite common, typically for the processed fruit. But more and more growers are trying to use machine harvest for fresh market as well. So there's some improvements in the technology and also the techniques we're using during harvest in order to get a high enough quality product using the harvesters to go for fresh market. Some of the typical practices that we use are shown here. So looking at sawdust incorporation into the soil prior to forming raised beds. Most of our plantings are done on raised beds at this point to improve production and drainage during the wintertime when we have our wet season. Most fields use trellis now to help keep the bush in good shape for either hand or machine picking. And then weed mat is very commonly used at this point in time, but there's other mulches, typically Douglas fir sawdust, that also can be used, but again, weed mat is more common at this point. Our plants are pruned annually in the wintertime. And fertigation is quite common now. So, using the drip irrigation system to deliver the fertilizer and doing that in tandem with our tissue nutrient sampling to be sure we're applying the right nutrients at the right time to our plants. And going along with that, we have updated our nutrient management guidelines for Oregon in the last couple of years. So I'll share a little bit about that at the very end of the presentation. Trellis does not generally impact the amount of time it takes to prune or the amount of wood we prune off, but research here in Oregon did show that we get improved machine harvest efficiency, and that can be about 3 to 8% of the total yield. So that's basically just shaping up the bush and improving access to the machine, and so we get less fruit dropped on the ground during that time. It also probably helps with hand harvest efficiency, just to make sure that, you know, we're not having to avoid fruit that's touching the ground because the branches are just drooping down from the fruit like you see in that top picture. And it just makes it easier, it keeps the fruit in an area that's easy to reach for hand harvest as well. So like I said, that top picture is what production systems in Oregon looked like a while back. You know, this is overhead irrigation, flat ground instead of raised beds, and no trellis there. So, you know, big healthy plants, but we found some efficiencies through our research and through grower practices by adding that trellis and doing things like using drip irrigation. So the cost estimate is about $1,700 per acre for that trellis, but you know, if we're getting increased machine harvest or hand picking efficiency and better food safety, then it's sort of a winning combination at this point. We did do a study looking at a divided style trellis. This was done in Legacy, which was getting hand and machine picked. And we were trying to improve the harvest efficiency, especially for hand picking. This is a very high yielding cultivar, so it takes a long time to pick because there's so much fruit and they're very dense bushes. So these are pretty young plants that we were working with, but basically we did not find any difference in the percentage of dropped fruit during harvest or the amount of time it took to harvest between the divided and the normal T trellis. So we found that about 7% of the fruit was dropped when we hand picked and about 23% was dropped when we machine picked, no matter the type of trellis that we had. It also took longer to prune because we were trying to sort of clear out the middle of that V canopy, and it didn't yield any higher, so basically it cost more to prune per pound of fruit harvested. And you see it's only 1 penny per pound difference, but obviously that adds up the more acres you have and the higher yield you have. So that can be important in the long run. Now on to weed mat. So weed mat is a polyethylene fabric. It typically has a 5 to 10 year lifespan depending on the product that you're using. And it can either be installed as a single piece or in a zippered system. So these photos here show the weed mat being installed as a single piece. And typically you would roll this out using a tractor, and oftentimes folks will use an implement, which we're not showing here, but would be really helpful to bury the edges of the weed mat in order to keep it from blowing away. So we in our research fields often just use ground staples to staple it in, but then it's helpful to have some T-posts or something heavy to weigh those down so that the wind doesn't catch the piece of weed mat in the wintertime and rip it away, which can potentially damage plants. So generally the drip lines get installed underneath the weed mat, and then we roll the weed mat out on top, and then you can cut holes where the plants are going to go. These are photos of the zippered system. So in this case, the plants are already in the ground, and we use 2 pieces of weed mat which overlap in the middle. So they're each about 3 feet wide with maybe a foot of overlap in the middle. And so you roll out one piece, and in this case, we had to cut a line where the plants are so that we are not pushing over the plants with the weed mat, staple it down on the one side, roll out the other side, and kind of do the same, and then you sort of form this little V shape, cut out where the plants are, and you can see the drip line underneath that as well. And again, if we can bury the edges, that can be very helpful just to hold everything in place. So there's a lot of positive aspects of using the weed mat. In organic blueberries, we found that it reduced weeding time by 75 to 80% compared to using a sawdust or a compost mulch. And it increased cumulative yield by 4% over the first 6 years of fruiting. So that can add up for you. In conventional production, it reduced the cost and labor for herbicides. So this is important, and it's actually been impactful enough that many conventional producers are using weed mat as a way to reduce the amount of herbicides and weeding time they're needing to spend out in the field. There are some negatives, however. So we found in that same study that I showed in the last slide that we had increased water use by about 60 gallons per plant per year. That was averaged over an 8-year period. We also had lower soil organic matter than when we used organic mulches such as sawdust or compost, so 1 to 2% lower, which over time can make a difference in our productivity. We also saw reduced root growth during early establishment, and our voles. The voles love to live under this stuff. They're protected from predators, and it's just a nice, cozy place for them to hang out. On soil temperature, sort of a mixed bag. In the springtime, having a little warmer temperatures under the weed mat might be good and help the roots start growing, but it could be bad in summer. We have pretty big fluctuations in temperature from day to night, and it's just hotter than the plant really likes it to be under the weed mat in the summertime. And of course, there's the upfront cost of installing the weed mat and then the disposal cost and renewal cost when it needs to be replaced. We did some studies trying to figure out if we could mitigate the negative aspects of the weed mat. So we did a study in Duke from 2016 to 2020, and we were comparing green weed mat to black weed mat with and without sawdust underneath and comparing that to just a regular sawdust mulch. So the green didn't really have any benefit compared to the black, and it was pretty expensive and hard to source. So basically looking at the use of sawdust underneath black weed mat, we had the greatest plant dry weight, so kind of the most biomass, similar or higher yields as weed mat alone, and basically higher profit overall because the sawdust alone needed replenishment and then when it was used as a standalone mulch, whereas the sawdust underneath weed mat lasts for quite a long time. And with the higher yields compared to the weed mat alone, we're getting a higher profit, even though we have a higher upfront cost of the sawdust weed mat combination. And really few voles, it turns out they don't like the feel of the sawdust or it's a deterrent to them for some reason. And they really didn't live under the weed mat as much when we had sawdust combined with the weed mat compared to weed mat alone. When we look back at the organic field, we ended up adding weed mat over the existing sawdust that was in that field and continued our trial. And we found that yield increased 41% with that combination compared to a 12% increase over the same time period for weed mat on bare soil. So about 30% greater increase in yield compared to that weed mat on bare soil. And the soil organic matter continues to be higher and the pH lower in a more appropriate range for blueberry with that combination of weed mat with sawdust. And so now, even 7 years after applying the weed mat, we continue to see higher yield with the combination. And again, slow degradation of sawdust when it's covered up and is not getting blown away, stepped on, washed away, etc. So that really can last a long time. We'll move on to pruning really quick. In our region, we're doing this annually from December to March typically. This is a picture of a commercial pruning crew in our organic blueberry research field. I really try to get rid of that stuff like you see in the middle picture. So anything that's really twiggy and has fruited itself out to achieve that balance of vegetative vigor with fruit production. The goals of our pruning, number one, especially if you're machine harvesting, is to narrow up the crown so that there are not big holes where fruit falls through those catcher plates and increases the amount of drop on the ground during harvest. We also want to open up the canopy, and this reduces disease pressure on our fruit and on the foliage. And it can also reduce pressure from spotted wing Drosophila because there's getting more sunlight and less humidity in there, which is less conducive to SWD egg laying. And hopefully we're getting more efficient picking, especially when hand picking. So the goal, basically you want to, of course, cut out some of the oldest wood and some of the fruiting wood we just need to thin out so we don't have quite so many fruiting buds and we can maintain that balance. We've done some different trials over the year looking at different ways to try and reduce the cost of pruning. So with speed pruning, the idea is to remove a few older canes each year and cut off the low growth. So in this photo, you can see the wood on the ground is what we cut out. So these are fairly young plants, but you can still see that's an older cane cut out from the middle of the bush and some smaller stuff that we cut out from the bottom. This was a trial that we did in mini blues, which is a small fruited cultivar intended for a processing market. But this speed pruning reduced our pruning time by about 80% compared to a typical pruning that we do in northern highbush blueberry. And it maintained berry size better than the unpruned plants. And again, this is a small fruited cultivar, so we don't care too much if the fruit gets a little bit smaller because it's already quite small and that's the intended market. If you're looking for a large berry hand picking, this might not be something you'd want to do, but if depending on your market, it could potentially save money. And we maintain the same Brix levels in the fruit with this pruning technique. We did try summer hedging, which I know is something that is done in some cases here in the Southeast. In our region, it is not successful. So that photo shows me taking a gas-powered hedger to our bushes after harvest. So this was in kind of mid to late July. And then this main photo shows the plants the following year. So we got really nice regrowth, but there was no fruit above the point where I hedged. So all the fruit is below that trellis wire there. And anything above it that I cut off, it regrew nicely, but there was not enough time for flower buds to develop. So we had no fruit above that point. And so we just did this 1 year, and it was clearly not successful for northern highbush in our area. You really need a longer fall growing season in order for those flower buds to develop to be able to do the summer hedging. Now there are some folks looking at winter hedging in order to, again, to save on labor and just getting the job done in a quick amount of time. So there's commercial growers that are trialing this on mature plants. And this is a photo of a machine hedger that a company is developing for blueberry and some of the other berry crops. And some preliminary results from Legacy. This is just on kind of fruit quality, not looking at yield. I don't have those data, but they found that berries that were harvested from plants that were machine pruned were slightly softer at harvest, a little smaller, and had more internal bruising damage. So, you know, I can understand why people are trying this, but I think it's wise to go about it with caution because they're cutting off, potentially cutting off the fruiting buds. They're not really clearing out the center of the bushes. It's probably going to make it harder to come back and hand prune those in the future if that gets deemed necessary. So I'm looking forward to more research on this. I know that people are interested in it, but I would say proceed with caution on winter hedging at this point. Onto leaf tissue sampling. So different standards are being developed based on growing region. So you're going to have different sufficiency standards here in the Southeast, and depending on maybe the cultivar or species that you're growing, than we have in Oregon. But the things we do know are that our cultivars must be sampled separately. So there's genetic differences which are really important to keep in mind, and we know that even if we're doing everything right, the cultivars will be different from each other. Now, research in Oregon that we did showed that the sample time should be the same no matter the fruiting season. So even if something fruits in June versus September, our research showed that the patterns of nutrients throughout the plant really stayed the same. It was just that the levels were different. So in the Pacific Northwest, we still recommend sampling late July to early August. And according to the guides that I've seen for the Southeast, it looks like sampling should take place 2 weeks after harvest. So that's going to be earlier in the season. And of course, your sufficiency standards are adapted to that sampling time. So it's important just to follow the standards for your region, including the sampling time. Now, taking a look at our standards and how they were updated, our nitrogen range was actually expanded because we know that organic blueberries often have lower levels of nitrogen, whereas conventional might have higher. So we know that plants can really produce a healthy yield with good quality within a broader range than was formerly in the guide. With phosphorus and potassium, we adjusted the range down to account for production practices and what we found again in our research, which I'll go into in the next slide for a moment. And then many of the nutrients we kept the same because the levels were appropriate. And for a few of the nutrients, magnesium and manganese, we narrowed the range just to more closely match what we've seen in the research and in grower fields throughout our area. And then we lowered the range for copper because the original standards were designed when copper fungicides were in more common use. And now that they're not, we can really go with a lower standard. So like I mentioned, organic systems may have lower levels of nitrogen, but also phosphorus, despite the addition of these nutrients at similar ranges to what we might be using in conventional systems. There's something about the organic system that the leaf levels may just be lower. We've seen that commonly. We also know that leaf nitrogen is not always correlated with yield when we're within the sufficiency standard. So higher nitrogen does not always mean higher yield. And so we can't make that assumption and do our fertilizer using that assumption. We need to really just make sure we're within the range, but we don't have to be at the high end in order to have good production. Our leaf phosphorus is usually low despite fertilization in Oregon. So, even if we're applying pretty high amounts, our leaf levels are often still low. So that's why we lowered that range. And I would just say to be wary of applying excessive fertilizer, because it may not even get taken up by the plant. If it doesn't need it, it won't take it up. Or if other nutrients are in imbalance, it won't take it up. So, you need to address what the actual cause is and only apply the fertilizers if your tissue tests say that it's necessary. And then on potassium, we found that high potassium is related to lower yield in Oregon, and it's also related to lower uptake of things like calcium and magnesium. So applying it to the soil as needed, according to leaf and soil tests, is very important, and not applying excess just because it happens to be in the fertilizer that you might use. Really only apply it if you actually need it. So thank you. I know that was a very quick overview of some of our standard production practices, but please reach out if you have any questions. I'm always available to answer those via email there on your screen. So thank you very much.
Yes.
Morning.
Good morning. Do we have any questions for Amanda?
Regrowth of the plant.
Could you hear that question, Amanda?
No, can you repeat that?
Good morning, Amanda. Yeah, you said that the hedging that you did during the summer hedging, the regrowth didn't have flower buds in there. So how long do you need to hedge it or to be able to have flower buds on that regrowth area of the hedging?
So it's a little echoey, but I think the question was if there was a way, like how could we do the hedging in the summer to still have flower buds? Is that correct?
Very good. Thank you. Yeah.
Did I hear that question correctly?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I think because of just the timing of when our fruit is coming on, so that variety ripens throughout July, basically. It's kind of mid to late July, and then it's done, and then we did the hedging immediately after harvest. And there really just isn't enough time in our growing season because the leaves are falling, things are shutting down by, mid-September maybe because the days are shorter and the temperatures are cooler. So I think you'd have to, I don't even know if you had the very, very earliest season variety, like maybe a Duke or another variety that's done by the beginning of July, maybe there's a chance, but we just didn't see any fruit whatsoever on that regrowth, and so I'm doubtful that there's a way to do that summer hedging in our climate. If you're somewhere where there's a warmer climate, like some of the southern states, I think obviously people are doing it there with some success. So it's going to depend on which variety and the climate in your growing region, but I'd be happy to talk to you more if you want to reach out by email also.
Are there any more questions? Was the $1,700 an acre for trellising or hand labor?
That was for, I think that's for just the materials on trellis.
Does she have a cost factor on hand pruning?
Do you have a cost factor on hand pruning?
I do, but I don't know it off the top of my head. So that's another one I'd be happy to provide if they want to reach out. It's just amanda.davis@oregonstate.edu, or you can just look me up online. I'd be happy to chat more.
Are there any other questions for Amanda? That looks like it's it, Amanda.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, well that concludes this session. Again, the scanner for the name badges is there at the door. If it don't work, get with them at the education desk and they'll get you together on it. So thank you all for attending this session.